right, so we're going to get underway because Jessica Jones has done so. Welcome, everybody. My name is Andrew Boreen. I have been an affiliate with George Mason University Law School's National Security Institute. Gosh, I don't even know how long. A very long time, Jessica. From when it began as pretty much just an email list and what was available on Jamil Jaffer's cell phone text threads. Yeah. So it's kind of fun. I've been overseas for about a year since I left federal service at Office of the Director of National Intelligence and the National Counterterrorism Center. And great to be back. And just to talk about, I'm sure you're all aware of this, the National Security Institute has really created out of nothing, other than those text threads at the start and the email, a really robust, I would argue not just bipartisan, but nonpartisan policy community in a town where we desperately need that. And I am now a former, so I get to say things that I really feel. And it is that the just personal observation, there's been so much rhetoric coming from domestic politics, but my career started in a time when it was very easy to bring people together around security issues, economic security, physical security, human security. And so I'm really thankful that NSI has grown like it has, and I hope you all stay engaged with a lot of the programming. It's cool that it's housed at a law school, because as you all are aware, the Constitution and legislation really impact foreign policy in very robust ways. Jamil is not here, but I'm giving a shout out to Jamil Jaffer. And I also want to say thanks to Kelly. This is part of the series on Russia and Iran's influence in the world and global repression. Today we're going to focus on the Middle East, and we've got a really excellent panel. I think one of the things, and my understanding, and forgive me if I'm wrong, because you're all, I see many young faces, and I say young because now, I'm old. But I was joking. Inside each of you is a future old person that will see one of your best friends that you have not seen in years, who has been overseas in one case, Ukraine and Afghanistan before that. And you'll wave at them. And then you'll be, God, I remember that time we went to the event when, you know. So I hope you have so much fun in your career. But in the past year, since I left federal service, I've been at a company called Flashpoint. It's a threat intelligence firm. We cover geopolitical risk, cyber threats, and all physical risks, all threats, informing really, really large enterprise and allied governments on future threats. But I've been to Ukraine twice since I left federal service. Most recently, I was in Kyiv on the same day that Russia tested a new hypersonic missile into the center of Kyiv, and was launching Shahed drones, which is going to come up in our conversation, because Shahed drones are manufactured in Iran. So my favorite quote as we prepared for this panel, and when I got asked to moderate it, was bumper sticker: regional issues are not regionally quarantined. And I didn't come up with that. It bubbled out as we were discussing in preparation for the panel. And that is really important when we think about Russia's role anywhere on the planet right now. So Ukraine is a local conflict, but it is not only related to the boundaries of Ukraine and its immediate neighbors. The Middle East and Russian influence within it is not only about the Middle East. Collaboration with Iran is not only about regional Middle Eastern politics, it's about a global repression collaboration to stifle dissent, to stifle free speech, to really, and you can see it in both, we'll talk about it with the panel, but you see about it in both systems. They may come at it from different historical legacy approaches, but there is not space for individual liberty. There's not space for universal human rights. That's just not how those systems are wired. And so I think that this is a really important starting conversation and has a lot of potential for future conversations about global repression and kind of this, I've referred to it as a rogues gallery of Axis powers that are getting closer. Russia and North Korea just last week. Putin returned with a pledge of support from North Korea. Russia and China aligning on trade. Russia and Iran. So we're going to continue to see, I think, a lot of these regional issues with super regional and global impact. The next, I will introduce each of our panelists briefly, and I'll just kind of start my immediate left. Dr. Mark Katz was at George Mason University's Schar Schar School.
Schar School, yeah.
35 years.
That's right.
Congratulations on retirement, sir.
Well, thank you.
Again, it's like interagency. You get the whole government working together. We got the Schar and the law school, same panel. It's a beautiful thing. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, global fellow at the Wilson Center for Russia and the Middle East. To his left is Martha Miller, who is a senior fellow with the National Security Institute. She's a former special assistant to the president for President George W. Bush. That's number 43. I realize now that may be ancient history to some of us.
It is.
Yeah, no, I mean it. It's yeah. So, but she led a lot of efforts on staffing and policy for the State Department and global diplomacy. In addition to direct work with the White House at an executive office of the president level. So I think we'll ask Martha some questions about this global repression and what does the United States potentially need to think about in addressing its expansion. Behnam Ben Taleblu, far end, not quite go in immediate order here, is a senior fellow covering Iran at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He just published a monograph, and the title is fantastic. Highly recommended reading here. Arsenal, Assessing the Islamic Republic of Iran's Ballistic Missile Program. And that's their offensive missiles, not their air defenses missiles. So strongly recommended reading for those concerned about Middle Eastern power dynamics and ordnance delivery. He also just testified before the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Europe and Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia on the same issue. And so I think that'll be really helpful. We have technical experts that really understand the science behind these weapon systems. We're not just talking policy, we're talking mechanics and ranges, so that's really helpful. Dr. Ray Takei is a senior fellow for the Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. As an NSI senior fellow, I'm obligated, whether you are an NSI affiliate or not, and you're new to DC or you're in your first few years, CFR is an amazing resource as well. Definitely, if you get invited to a thing or invited to a term membership, highly recommend. It's paid massive dividends for me in my career. Very honored, Ray, that you made time to be with us today. There's a few things going on with the Middle East where CFR wants experts out there. So glad you're with us. His most recent book was called The Last Shah, America, Iran, and the Fall of the Pahlavi Dynasty. And for those who also want extra academic reading, you can read about the fall of the Pahlavi Dynasty and Kermit Roosevelt's role therein. Kermit was perhaps CIA's most famous and distinguished operations officer of that era. So I'd like to thank all our panelists and start with a question. And Mark, I'll start with you because the Ukraine piece is very close to me personally. It hits home. I say hits home, I'm not even kidding, because Shahed drones come. And we see weird supply chain, not weird, we see this Axis supply chain where the Shahed drone manufactured in Iran, used in Ukraine, also carries Chinese components and parts. So I don't know if you could speak to us a little bit about what extent Russia's prosecution of its actual hot war relies on this Iranian relationship in the Middle East.
Well, as soon as I figure out how to turn this thing on.
You're on.
Oh, I'm on.
You're on.
Oh, well, sorry about that. Okay, first of all, I just want to say it's an honor to be invited by NSI to come and speak with you all. So it's great. I hope there's going to be more cooperation between NSI and the Schar School's International Security Program. I think that would be a very good thing. With regard to your question, I think Russia will be prosecuting this war whether it got Iranian drones or not. They would be doing this. But in that they are getting Iranian drones, it's really helpful to them. And certainly, we have one of our former students, Jason Smart, who's over there. And what he describes, maybe you can also know, just as well, is that the Iranian drones come over, they swarm. A lot of Ukrainian air defense assets are used on those, and then the big boys from Russia, the larger missiles, come down. So I think that the Iranian contribution to this war has been very important, certainly in terms of causing damage to Ukraine. Russia would prosecute the war anyway, but they're able to do so much more readily with Iranian support, for sure.
And I think, so I'm going to add color to that because I've been through it a few times now, where the Ukrainian civil defense system puts out an app on everybody's phone in Ukraine. And you can see when the air raid alerts come in, and you can actually track, and it'll tell you 30 Shaheds launched. And it'll show you the zones as they get intercepted. And I'm going to say at least 90% of them, in my experience, usually get knocked down. But that Shahed volume coming in day after day into civilian targeted sites, they end up in many ways just becoming like indiscriminate, almost like car bombs or IEDs. They're not targeted by the time they get in because they've sent just this kind of scatter. And so I wonder, what are your thoughts on if that could be disrupted in some way? Could that have benefits in reducing Russia's really cognitive warfare or population-centered warfare in Ukraine?
Well, clearly, if it could be disrupted, that would benefit Ukraine tremendously. It would also spare their civilians, spare their scarce weapons systems. I guess so far I don't think we've come up with a good way. Yeah. Personally, I think that we could do more to disrupt Iranian production of these things or the transit of those weapons to Russia. But yeah, I think that you bring up a good point.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate it, Mark. And then Benham, back to Iran, and we were just talking about drones, but maybe you could talk a little bit about surface-to-surface ballistic missiles. And again, just for the benefit of audience, very smart people may not be super familiar with the differences between ballistic missiles, air defense system missiles, and what it would mean what does it mean if they step it up from these Shahed drones into deeper penetrating systems?
Okay, great. Well, also just wanted to echo Mark real quick. It's a privilege and honor to be here. Thank you guys for turning out. We know it's not just a lunch, so thank you for coming, and pleasure to be on the panel with you all. It's a great question, just in terms of delivery, so everybody's on the same page. Drones and cruise missiles fly basically parallel with the surface of the Earth and are low and slow. Ballistic missiles have a parabolic trajectory, and they fly high and fast. That's the big difference. Drones, particularly what you call kamikaze drones or suicide drones or one-way attack drones, these different kind of social names that the U.S., media, think tank people, U.S. government has come up with to describe the Shahed 131 and the Shahed 136. These are the triangular or delta wing drones that Iran has given Russia. These essentially are called in the Middle East the poor man's cruise missile. So they achieve the same effect as a cruise missile, but cost considerably less. So Russia actually has quite a few cruise missiles. Iran is actually quite poor in terms of land attack cruise missiles. What really started Iran's land attack cruise missile program was about 20, 25 years ago, they illicitly procured a Soviet copy of a land attack cruise missile, and then their program got off to a start there. But these drones fly low and slow. They're cheaper to produce. The theory of the case here is quantity has a quality of its own. And kind of like what Mark said, if these open up the adversary to expand their air defense systems, their surface-to-air missile systems, then the chances of what Russia has left, because remember, what the West is doing, what America is doing, what the EU is doing, is trying to use economic measures as well as militarily defensive measures to prevent Russia from winning. So the Russians are trying to stay in the fight longer and longer, and to give their defense industrial base this kind of a boon, they'll use the cheaper Iranian stuff to open up the adversary, and then they can choose to either follow up the same course with their own cruise missiles, which they have a much more diverse array of cruise missiles than the Iranians, or their own ballistic missiles. What really could be a game changer here is if the Iranians give them the ballistic missiles. There was a story late January, early February this year, it was only Reuters, the US government did not confirm it, no other agency confirmed it, that the Iranians had stepped up and actually given them short-range ballistic missiles. The US government defines short range as just under 1,000 kilometers. So by way of mental example, what the Houthis in Yemen were firing at Riyadh, about 900 kilometers away, that is still considered short range. The Reuters story said that some ballistic missiles, basically between 300 to 700 kilometers, had been transferred. No one else confirmed it. In my view, this is the Iranians actually trying to gauge what is the Western response going to be if we do end up delivering these systems. And the reason they could be a game changer is rather than be a force multiplier for Russian cruise missiles, this would be a force multiplier for Russian ballistic missiles. And you don't just have to take it from me in terms of phasing between how the Iranians and Russians choose to fight in an area together. They know the relative capability and cost of different forces. So in a place like Syria, for instance, even though they may have converging 500,000-foot goals and then diverging tactical goals at the battlefield level, you remember, Iran used basically conscripted Afghan and Pakistani Shia militias as cannon fodder to open up the space for their preferred proxy, Lebanese Hezbollah, which cleared the space, and then the Russians would come in with air power. So think of a very layered approach. And the Iranians, unfortunately, are contributing with these diverse packages, these diverse platforms, to a more layered Russian approach that could target civilian infrastructure, critical infrastructure, and then slowly military assets.
Yeah, thank you. And I really appreciate the explanation of that low and slow technology, drones, and cruise missiles, vice ballistic, because it's really important for the next question I'm about to ask Dr. Takei. So Dr. Takei, let's bring it back. So we zoomed out a bit globally. We looked at Europe, Ukraine, how Iran is supplying not only that Russian fight, Iran is also supplying its own fight. And you had mentioned briefly the proxy actors like the Houthis, but let's think about April when Iran, from its own territory, launched a massive onslaught of these combined projectiles, some low and slow, perhaps some ballistic. And I'm wondering if you could talk us through a little bit, Ray, what happened in April and how effective was that strike on Israel using that technology? And can they support both their own needs and the needs of the Russian client elsewhere on the planet?
Yes. Again, I want to echo what others have said about the privilege of being here with some old friends and some newer friends.
I'm new.
It's all relative. The April event is an extraordinary important event because something happened that hasn't happened in 45 years of enmity between Israel and Iran. For 45 years, both sides were relatively satisfied with keeping their conflict and their enmity at a more surrogate level. Now, I do understand that Israelis have been attacking Iranian military encampments in Syria, but nevertheless, neither party was transgressing the territory of others in a direct confrontational way. The first question that needs to be asked within the intelligence community outside it is, why did Iran make decision? Who was involved in the national security decision making? Why did this decision happen that hadn't happened before? Who are the cast of characters involved? Why did previous caution was thrown to the wind? What level of confidence they had? All those questions about inner working of the national security apparatus that for the first time produced a decision that was rather extraordinary and without precedent. And if you had asked people before April whether Iran would directly launch 300 projectiles toward Israel, they would probably said no, because the previous pattern of their aggression toward Israel was using proxies and some measure of deniability. So there's a boldness and recklessness coming out of the system. That leads me to believe there's been a change of personnel in how national security decisions are being made. There's something different about the system and its inner workings that we don't seem to understand at this point. And that's a critical point. There are two ways of looking at that event. Number one, I think the Israelis accepted the American argument, that acceded to the American argument that the operation should be judged by its logistical failure as opposed to its intent, which was a mass casualty event. The Israelis conceded to that argument. So what the Iranians were trying to do is kill a lot of people, and the Israelis chose to respond because of the failure of the operation. So this is we may be in a new frontier in the region at this particular point, where the Iranian regime that has always been reckless but is less circumspect than before doesn't have sufficient munitions to send to the Russian Federation, as well as waging its low-intensity conflict. Probably they can always produce what Behnam says, these cheaply constructed arsenal. The question of Russian relationship with Iran, however, goes two ways. Is what level of cooperation are they getting from the Russian in order to advance the sophistication of their projectiles, and also whatever technical obstacles they have in terms of their nuclear program, if any. So I think the April event is an extraordinary event. I might say it's rather a remarkable event, simply because it argues that the Islamic Republic has entered a new phase in terms of its national security decision-making, where it's willing to be far bolder and reckless. Had those missiles landed in a significant way, and one of them did land, hit an apartment building, then we're talking about potentially a regional war, whose conclusion, to say the least, is uncertain. The other thing one can say about that event, the Israeli nuclear deterrence was obviously not a deterrent. They had no concern about the Israeli nuclear arsenal when they launched this massive attack. I don't think it works the other way. I think the Iranian nuclear deterrent would prove much more formidable. But it also punctured the idea of some degree of Israeli invincibility and the reliability and importance of its nuclear arsenal. It's that way. And that's not good for Israeli security posture that is already diminished because of the events that have taken place since October 7th, may take place in the northern frontier, and with all the resulting divisions in Israeli politics and American-Israeli relations.
Yeah, and I think that was going to be my next question. So we've just because in the last week we've heard noises about possible campaigns into Lebanon, and the assessments I've always read are that Hezbollah has a significantly more robust conventional military capacity than Hamas, and they're a little less scrappy and a little more organized, a lot more robust, and that would, in many ways, as you said, what was proxy warfare, what was action in the gray zone with surrogates like Houthis or Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And so I guess my question is then in terms of kind of assessments or your perceptions on supply levels. So Israel was able to defeat 99.9% of a massive onslaught. So are there concerns about one, and I'm going to add the Israeli side, but are there concerns about the Israeli side's ability to defend in the event of Iranian surge in supply? And is Iran able to continue a fight in the region if Israel moves into Lebanon and if Iran were to continue to try to attack and support directly as they did? Or is there going to be a supply pinch from Iran on a two-front conflict?
I'll leave the supply pinch to Behnam, who studies the arsenal. It's my impression that they have the production capacity to do this. They can maintain a lot of things. The Hezbollah front is interesting because it would be reasonable for Israel and Hezbollah to not get into a conflict that will certainly destroy much of Lebanon and destroy another insubstantial amount of Israel itself, Haifa and so on. So it's reasonable for both parties to essentially draw some kind of try to diminish the conflict. But if you look at the Middle East since October 7th, who has acted reasonably? Who's behaved in a reasonable way? Not the Iranians, not the Hamas, arguably not the Israelis. So we are living in an unreasonable age. And the old adage is, the old conventional wisdom may not apply. I think we're in a situation where we have to turn our assumptions into questions. Neither Lebanese nor the Israelis can live within the northern or southern frontier in their case, where a substantial number of their population cannot actually return to their respective homes. That's a situation that has to be addressed. Similar with with other parts of Israel. That is a threat to the national integrity and territorial sovereignty of Israel. They have to eventually do something in the northern frontier, and that actually can provoke a far more of a destructive attack. It is said it's reasonable to expect that the Iranians do not want Hezbollah to perish in a war with Israel because of their own second strike capability that Hezbollah represents. But I would say it before April 14 attack, whatever it was, that it was not reasonable for the Iranians to launch 300 projectiles toward Israel. But so we're living in the age of a certain degree of unpredictability, where you have to excise the following phrase from your lexicon. Wow, that's unusual.
I think that's a good pivot to ask Martha to join the conversation. So Martha, you obviously were part of an administration that saw a different but a very significant strategic pivot in the way that the United States was engaging with the rest of the world. And in accepting the world as it is, as some senior officials in that administration used to say, right? It's not what America wanted it to be, it's the world as it is. I guess my question is, Ray's quote, "We're living in an unreasonable age." If you could just talk a little bit about that from a systemic level with Russia as a power, Iran as a power, and now let's kind of zoom out from the Middle East a bit. Do we see a high degree of cooperation, overtly or quietly, covertly, between Russia, Iran, and is that, what's the scope of that globally?
So I think, thank you. I think it's fair to say that, we have been in retreat. The United States has been in retreat, I would argue, since the Bush administration. And there are a lot of reasons that things have developed in that manner. That being said, if you were Putin or any other leader around the world who would like to see in the end of American primacy or Western primacy in the world, that vacuum might be a strong word, but that lack of American engagement provides opportunity to act recklessly. And I think we've had numerous situations over the years across administrations, Republican or Democrat, where we have not kept to our red lines, so to speak, and I think we have essentially emboldened these regimes. So, if I can jump to, surveillance, for example, if that's okay.
Oh, 100%.
So I think, one, you asked about covert and other assistance and cooperation. I think the main thing to understand in terms of what's going on right now is Russia, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this latest one that is, they have become dependent on Iran for drones. And that has made Russia feel compelled, I think, to ensure that the Iranian regime is stable. And so, within Russia itself, as you might recall, they experienced a lot of dissent after the invasion of Ukraine, and they had to step up their efforts to squash this dissent. That created a cottage industry of, contractors, if you will, that provided software to the FSB to surveil, get into encrypted messages, and really be able to get into people's personal business to ensure that they had full control over the population. They then have exported this to Iran. I think there was a long New York Times article that went into great detail about this within the past year. And what essentially were Russian defense contractors then started doing work in Iran. So they have this mutual interest in suppressing dissent within their countries. And so on the one hand, we look at this you could look at it as a human rights issue, which it is. There are terrible human rights abuses taking place. At the same time, we cannot lose sight of the fact that these human rights abuses are it's actually a national security threat because it is part of why, it's part of the engine, if you will. And it's part of the engine that is driving them to try to upend the world as, it sounds exaggerated, I guess, the world as we know it, but essentially the world where we expect rule of law to be followed, where borders should be respected, where you actually can go to the United Nations and reasonably expect there to be something useful coming out of it. So I guess I'll end there.
No, super important, and I don't think it's outlandish. I mean, my own personal assessment, right? But we've seen these powers referred to now as revisionist powers. They're trying to revise the world order that was established in 1947,
Right.
with institutions not only on the geopolitical front, but Bretton Woods economic agreements, right? It's a revision of, just as you said, the world as the free world allies have tried to build it in a transparent way that respects universal human rights and rule of law and transparent markets and all these things that America has stood for many, many decades. And so I think it's interesting because it's almost like Russia and Iran are boxed into kind of they're bedfellows by necessity.
Right.
Right? They're both isolated. They both need to control their populations. So I'm going to turn to Mark because you speak Russian and you've been tracking and academically looking at Russian issues a very long time. Are there potential seams, right? So if it's established that Russia and Iran are working together in repression of their own internal political debate and also externally in these other issues, are there potential seams that could be brought to bear to break up that alliance or break up that partnership?
Well, that's a good question because there are lots of differences between Russia and Iran, and there have been differences for some 2 centuries or more. And certainly, the image of Russia in Iran is very negative. They fought 5 wars. Iran basically lost them all, lost territory, etc. There's been lots of issues, but here's the thing. 15 years ago, I was one of those who thought it was possible to somehow break up the Russia-Iran relationship. I don't think it's possible anymore, at least not for us to do it. Because while there are a lot of differences between them, so long as they're both focused on seeing America and the West as their adversaries, that they will find a way to cooperate. In other words, that they are cooperating with each other despite their differences. They know what their differences are, and they're working together anyway. So, it's the one contingency that I see causing real problems is not a contingency that I think anyone in this room wants to see come out. But I remember how the Sino-Soviet split, that it was bad starting in the late 1950s, but it really became intense when the idea gained currency that America was on the decline, whether in Southeast Asia or anywhere else. That I think that, in other words, if they become convinced that the common adversary is not such an adversary after all, then I think we will see them pursue their interests more competitively. But as I say, I don't think any of us wants to do anything ourselves to bring that situation about, and that but that it could occur. And just as America was supposedly on the decline in the 1970s, well, I remember I lived through it. Marxist revolution after Marxist revolution in what we call the Third World back then. 10 years later, communism collapses. Yeah, it's when these guys get overextended, they don't have the resilience that the United States has to absorb loss after loss as we have. That they can't afford this, but but that's a contingency that I don't see happening. I don't want to happen, and in the meantime, I think that their relationship is going to be good. And the thing is, it's the other contingency will be a change of regime in one or both countries. In other words, that I think that a successor to Putin, even one of his people, is more likely to see China as an adversary, more likely than Putin. In fact, it's really kind of bizarre. Certainly when one could go to Russia and talk to young Russians, they're all afraid of China, and they don't really understand why their president isn't. And I think that, that there's a sense that Putin has the idea that if and when China becomes a real threat to Russia, then Russia can pivot to the West, and that the West will, despite all inconvenience from before, will work with Russia against China because it will be in the West's interest to do so. I don't think the West operates quite on that basis, but I think that from Putin's geopolitical mindset, that makes sense. That he has that, he can worsen relations with the West when he wants, and he can improve them when he wants, or so he thinks. And that I think is, a different leader would think very differently. And of course, a different Iranian government might also think very differently.
So regime change in either place might get us where we go. Benham, I want to continue along that thread, but so I was trying to find seams, not super optimistic in what I heard from Dr. Katz. Do you see unifying forces between Russia and Iran, right? Because he mentioned multiple wars between the nations. How robust and stable is that partnership relationship? Is it likely to expand into these kinetic ballistic missiles and drones and kind of interests alignment? And could it move into things like nuclear technology cooperation or economic cooperation as a bloc to kind of counter allied markets? Or, I guess what's the likelihood of 100,000 exchange students from Russia going to Tehran and 100,000 Iranian students being sent to Moscow? Like, when does it move to that level of open trust?
Well, there's a lot of things on the table right now.
Yeah.
I want to kaleidoscopically begin to kind of piece them together, two of which I want to hop on the back end of what Mark said. So I totally agree on the history of mistrust. The interesting thing now is that the leaders in both countries have been able to quarantine off that nationalist mistrust for purposes of regime security and regime survival. And the more acute they feel threats to regime security and regime survival, they will be doing more of these quote-unquote unconventional things. That might be tactically divergent, but strategically pretty significant. From that flows two other things I wanted to say. One is a respectful area of disagreement with Mark, where currently, all else equal, given the revisionist nature, and particularly in Tehran, the opportunism, it's not just strategy, it's not just ideology, it's something in the middle, this opportunism that exists in Iranian foreign policy and national security decision making when faced with, a potential American decline or a potential American retreat. That doesn't mean that they consolidate and therefore become defensive. That means they press their advantage. So in either case of an American retreat or the perception of American decline, my view is the Russo-Iranian axis is likely to continue to push because they are the ones who have the response to that which was the status quo. They are revising the order. So anytime the order recedes, they will press the new order. And then if there's any contingencies and issues that come with that, let it be. Two contingency-related issues before we get to regime change, because I do totally agree that if you have regime change in Moscow or regime change in Tehran, that would be good for both populations, and potentially for U.S. national security, certainly on the Iran side at least. You have two more proximate events that could potentially begin to change things. The proximate event in Iran is the passing of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who's 85 now. You're about to have a presidential election on Friday. Presidents don't really control anything, but the whole point is he will be 89 by the time the president finishes his first term, so think about that in terms of Iran's octogenarian elite. And the second is, if you ever do get to a post-Ukraine war Russia, would you ever go back to that more transactional nature between Russia and Iran rather than the newfound transformational nature? And this is where that history of mistrust comes in, because basically 1500 to essentially mid-1990s, it is turbulent, the Russo-Iranian relationship. Then you move into the transactional phase into the 1990s. You can find Iranian officials talking about NATO expansion and echoing Russian talking points from the mid-1990s. So basically when the liquid propellant missile cooperation begins to take off, when the Russian assistance to Iran's nuclear program begins to manifest itself after the Iran-Iraq war. This is the incubation period for the transactional approach. And then really post-Syria is the incubation period for the transformational approach and the ability opportunistically to score least common denominator wins against what they perceive to be the Western order. And friends, I want to use the C word here, compartmentalization. This is what America's authoritarian adversaries are increasingly good at. It doesn't even have to be Iran-Russia. Look at Iran-Turkey. So different, the same history of mistrust, the same imperial legacy of competition, but in areas where they have a least common denominator, they're able to quarantine off that mistrust or that competition, achieve a least common denominator goal, and then go back to a newly regulated competition. So I think we need a little bit better lexicon, a little bit better understanding, rather than the static, they're allies or they're adversaries. And even Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany can help you think about this, because they need not look alike, they need not think alike. We may never get to a period of, 1 million or 100,000 exchange students, but we could still have things that drive the threat. And one area that drives the threat is, sir, you mentioned the testimony I did a few months back, actually, in this building. I shared screenshots of a video that the Iranian press itself had leaked after the Russian defense minister had come to Iran to visit with the IRGC Aerospace Force and everything. And the video was actually from 2019, so it was pre-pandemic, pre-Russia-Ukraine war. And it's the head of the IRGC Aerospace Force shaking hands with, I think, his Russian counterpart, and he's basically putting forward the Faustian bargain. He said, you help us develop the space command, we will help you develop a drone command. So the thinking about what they needed from each other's relative or comparative military advantages precedes this period. So we have to think very carefully about how some of our adversaries can walk and chew gum at the same time. And the area for us to capitalize on is where the mistrust itself can be magnified. So Russia used to, in 2015, 2016, stage bombers at an airbase in northwestern Iran, flying sorties into Syria. But due to domestic nationalist pressure, when it was uncovered, they couldn't do that. So potentially find areas for us to magnify. I think U.S. government, state, treasury, whatnot, have a huge role to play in highlighting the history of mistrust and then letting them fumble themselves into it. For too often, we are the ones reacting, giving our opponents an opportunity to kind of respond. We have to put them on the defensive. You have to be in the position or creating a policy where you're contracting the space for both countries, limiting the resources available, having them compete, and then let them make mistakes. And then that's when you can live in the Napoleonic world of, when your adversary is making mistakes, don't interrupt. Let them make the mistake, and that's where the U.S. can really swoon in. But if I just have to be very short and kind of mentioned 2 or 3 areas I'm very afraid of. Not necessarily economic integration, because they've talked a lot about interconnected banking and their economies are actually set up to be more competitive. Gas aside, the major trade is agricultural. One area you have to be concerned about is the Caspian Sea. It's basically the world's largest lake. I'm not talking about caviar fishing and all of the water rights, even though that is an issue. I'm talking about the ability for Iran to basically use boats to send these drones, the ability of some of these to be created in third-party jurisdictions like Tajikistan, which actually has a drone factory and is one of the Central Asian republics closer to Iran. The space program is huge. I think CIA Director Bill Burns talked about this. Iran's space program is basically a cover for an ICBM. You have major Russian support that could provide Iran with that last little bit, because Iran has both a civilian and a military space program. And in terms of nuclear diplomacy and where we go, Russia was a major partner in this. Post-Ukraine war, you're really going to have to excise that. And you're really going to have to be thinking about ways to get creative with pressure on Iran when there may be a Russian outlet, and vice versa.
Yeah, thank you. And I know Ray had a quick two-finger. We'll get to in a second, if it's okay, Ray. Not Ray. I'm sorry. Apologies. Mark had a quick two-finger. But we're getting about 15 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is I'll turn to Martha and Ray Take briefly on the other side of the Arabian Peninsula and some outcomes. Then I'll give you each kind of a quick 2-minute each to summarize, and I want to get some Q&A from the audience. That's really important, especially because I think we're touching on a lot of threads. But I wish we had a map. One of the things you learn early in your policy career is always use a graphic with a map. Whenever you make an article, where's the inset, where's the graphic? So thinking of Iran, and then the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, and then Africa, Martha, I'm going to go to you. What are the concerns? Again, you have the direct Middle Eastern region. We talked Iran, Israel. We've been talking Iran, Caspian on that side. Are there issues on the edge of Africa, right? Are there issues related to places like Sudan or the Horn of Africa or the other side of the Red Sea that we need to be thinking about? And what does it mean for, back to the big picture, State Department? Freedom of navigation. How do these issues factor in?
So obviously, I'm sure everyone has been following the events in the Red Sea that have been taking place I think since November, where the Houthis have been attacking commercial ships, claiming attacks and some attacks targeting U.S. naval vessels as well. Thankfully at this point that has been unsuccessful. But imagine if one of our destroyers gets hit, or a carrier. I think we all know that there will be some pretty big decisions to be made here in Washington if that were to happen. And I think we are probably on every single day that we have ships out there at risk of that. One interesting development that I followed is Russia has an agreement with the Sudanese to take a spot at Port Sudan, which is interesting because obviously this is actually on right there by the Red Sea. It's actually a pretty important port at the Horn of Africa. We actually have a presence in Djibouti, and so does China. So this is like Russia's one foothold. One interesting wrinkle with that is that Russia was actually supporting the rebels in Sudan until recently through the Wagner Group. And with the Wagner Group essentially kind of morphing into I don't know, I guess Africa Corps with the Russians. Anyway, they have now become, I guess as we've been talking about these transactional partnerships, they've now switched sides to the Sudanese government. But the Port of Sudan is a pretty good enticement. And then, who knows, that could allow them to take the gold that they were actually getting through the RSF, the rebels, and use that port as well. But anyway, back to the Red Sea and shipping. Obviously, the Red Sea is a huge transit area for global supply chain. We're lucky at this point that this has not created massive problems for our economy or Europe's economy more broadly. But the worse this gets with the Houthis and if Russia and Iran cooperate on the Red Sea, that could become a problem economically, geopolitically, militarily.
Yeah, thank you. And then, Dr. Take, I think there's a bigger question that I don't know we opened up talking briefly about the surrogate warfare between Israel and Iran. But Iran, for many years, has prosecuted its foreign policy largely through proxies, right? Hezbollah, Houthis, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, right? Putting pressure, and they use them extraterritorially as well. So Russia, I'm glad you brought up Wagner as another proxy actor in many ways, the Prigozhin network. So what do you see as second and third order effects for the proxy groups that have been, right? Iran tries to maintain plausible deniability, I think, in many cases, for what they do with the tech that they're given by Iran, or the arms. But with a tightening, potentially, Iran and Russia partnership, are there second and third order effects that might lead to benefit or harm to those proxy groups of Iran?
Sure, thanks. Honestly, the so-called axis of resistance strategy has been so profoundly successful that I think it probably surprised the Iranians. They can marshal this multinational force and deploy it to various fronts with extreme effect. And this is particularly important for a country itself is casualty sensitive. I think they marshal about 80,000 troops of these proxies during the war in Syria. This strategy has been successful. It helped defeat the United States in Iraq. It helped humble Saudi Arabia. It mauled Israel on October 7th. It has produced Iran a deterrent force in Hezbollah. And for a long time, people have been talking about how you can lessen Iran's impact and influence on those proxies, second, third effect, as you talk about. A lot of discussion has been said whether with economic sanctions, they have less money to hand out. I don't know the answer to that. I suspect the money can be shifted in terms of priority of who needs more. And for a while, they were giving less money for Hezbollah because Hezbollah needed less. But this strategy is no country in the Middle East has succeeded with such auxiliary force since the British Empire, which patrolled vast areas in South Asia and the Middle East, with using a sort of a non-British forces. The relationship with Russia and China, China helps cushion Iran economically, and Russia helps it in terms of defense cooperation that has been discussed. So in that particular sense, Iran has access to greater armament with a certain degree of sophistication that's increased over the time. The key to the Russian relationship that I think bears watching is whether that's taking place at the level of the Atomic Energy Organization on the nuclear front. Assuming the Iranians still have some technical difficulties, they may not, whether the Russians are assisting them to overcome those technical barriers. There was a long time it was suggested that the Russian Federation, irrespective of its leaders, did not want to see a nuclear-armed Iran on its southern frontier. I'm not quite sure if that's true today. I'm not quite sure that's ever been true. Russia has lived with adversarial nuclear weapons on its frontier, unlike the United States, whether it was NATO, whether it was Turkey, and so on. So it has lived with that situation, whether it's on the eastern frontier with China. So I think they will love a nuclear crisis in the Middle East, which further diverts American attention, resources, and so forth. That's the area I think bears watching, because the question that often is posed, and nobody has an answer to it, I don't have an answer to it, is why has Iran not detonated? There's, you know, that's a first order question to which nobody has a reliable answer. I don't particularly have a reliable answer. I have some postulations that I can invoke if you wish, but the question is why they haven't crossed the barrier where it's sort of a blue skies and green lights if they want to at this stage. The restraint is self-restraint. The question is why they're self-restrained.
Great questions, and I want to save, if we could, I think we have just a few minutes left. So I think answer each panelist, just, you know, if there was a question I didn't ask that you really wish I had asked, feel free to answer that with your, we'll cut it short, like about 60 seconds to 90 seconds. Or if you want to kind of make a summation for maybe after, we can have some sidebar conversation with attendees, and we'll just go right down the line. Doctor?
Okay, very good. Well, you know, I agree with Benham completely that if there's a perception of American decline, that the Iranians will expand very quickly. That is not what Russia wants them to do. And I think that part of this discussion, we talk about Russia and Iran, we have to talk about it in the context of Russia in the Middle East. And one of the amazing things about Russia in the Middle East is that Russia has good relations with each and every American partner in the region, including, despite the decline in relationship, with Israel to a certain extent. To me, that's an incredible feat, that of Russian diplomacy. And the Russians want to keep it that way. In other words, they want to keep a balance between these various states. They gain a lot from Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. They do not want Iran threatening those states. They don't want anything that would draw the U.S. back in, or you know, have a demand for that. So I think it's part of, in other words, that there would be differences. Yeah, Putin wants to expand, Iran wants to expand, but Putin doesn't necessarily want Iran to expand. Whereas dictators have a double standard when it comes to one another. Also, I think one has to keep in mind the Chinese factor. China has very important economic relations, not just with Iran, but also with the Saudis, with the Emiratis, and the Israelis. China does not want Iran wrecking any of this. And so I think that the dynamic of China's role in the region, again, they just want balance. Has to be taken into account. So Iran can't do anything it wants, even if it thinks America's on decline. As I said, I'm old enough to remember when this idea was prevalent. It turned out not to be true. One often wonders, are we doing this deliberately, projecting this impression to make people think we're weak when we're actually not? And you may think that's a foolish idea. People in this region actually do wonder about this.
Martha?
So we're obviously sitting in the Rayburn building where
I'm sure, I don't have a roster of who's here, but I imagine most of you are advising a member of Congress in some capacity. There were quite a few measures passed in the emergency supplemental, some important sanctions legislation that was included. Congress has such an important role in oversight. Ask the State Department, ask Treasury to come brief you on what's happening on the implementation of these laws that your bosses put forth and voted on. Make sure that Congress has a role, an active role in ensuring that whoever is elected president in the coming election is following the laws that Congress has passed. I think also try to approach it from a nonpartisan manner. I worked for President Bush. I worked in the Senate way back when, and no matter who you're working for, at the end of the day, I know things get highly political on the Hill. I used to be here in that time, but at the end of the day, it is important to rise above. And anyway, that's perhaps unsolicited advice, but my 2 cents.
Yeah, thanks, Martha. Great advice.
Right. First of all, a slight note of, I think, Mark, the Chinese-Israeli relations has changed since October 7th. The sort of anti-Semitic trope that the Chinese are doing, that relationship is no longer, it can't be reconstituted in the same way. If you look at all of America's adversaries, both within the Middle East and without, are behaving in an unpredictable way. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, that from an American perspective didn't make sense because the cost-benefit analysis was not as extraordinary, but they did it. The Chinese could have the slow path of incremental increase in their influence in East Asia beyond the down-shopping strategy of expanding your capacity and increasing your capabilities while also being embedded in the global economy. They chose not to do that. There was a kind of a disjunction and a departure. That didn't make sense from a cost-benefit analysis. We talked about the Iranians behaving differently. Look, it was not in Hamas's interest to attack Israel, but they did it. So the question is, why is everybody behaving differently? Why is everybody behaving unpredictably and boldly and recklessly? Is it because they have some sort of a comfort or strategic depth because of their alignment with each other? That's probably part of it. Is it because they look at the United States in terms of their public rhetoric? They all see the United States as a declining power, as power with its disorderly politics. They may misunderstand American politics, but they see it as a country frequently at odds with itself and therefore incapable of acting in a coherent manner. That may not be an accurate view of the United States, but so far that's what they're doing. So I think we kind of have to go back to the drawing board and figure out what our previous assumptions were and whether they're still valid. Because they increasingly over the past year, past 2 years really, before with the rise of President Xi and so on, all our assumptions have taken one substantial degree of battering. And too often we stick with those assumptions, with those paradigms, because we can't think of anything else to do. In case of Iran, I'll brief, we're locked in 2005. Our goal is arms control. Our preferred method of coercion is economic penalties, and our preferred modality is multinational. None of those factors are accurate today. Arms control is no longer relevant for the Iranians. There is no multilateral consensus, and economic penalties as a means of disciplining an adversary have been exaggerated altogether. And the reason why we stick with it, because we can't think of anything else to do. During his playing days, Larry Bird used to yell at the referee saying, "Is this it, or are you playing to get better?" That's a question everybody needs to ask themselves.
Yeah. We need a new policy for Iran, is what I'm hearing you say, Doctor.
We have a new policy for everything.
New policy for everything. You have abounding opportunities to advise these legislators to improve things. We'll just wind up with you, Benham, and then I'm fine sticking around a little bit if people want to do sidebars and have conversations.
Yeah,
and
I'm okay for a little bit.
yeah, let's go ahead.
Yes.
You have to go. So I'll try to put a very quick cherry on this Sunday with three kind of divergent points. Number one, kind of following from Ray, that now we need a new conception of what a Iran policy, what a Russia policy, potentially even what a China policy could look like. This is one of the few areas where you can do the right thing, and it's also the strategic thing. Standing with the Iranian people, standing with the Russian people is as both moral, as politically astute, as strategically sound. People working in foreign policy, national security decision making, you don't always get to align those three boxes: your politics, your values, and your strategy. I think on Iran and Russia in particular, we have this opportunity, depending on the issues you work on, depending on the orientation of your member and a whole host of other factors, there is space to scale this up. Whether that's human rights, whether that's collective defense, allied defense, whether that's economic coercion, whether that's making sure there's a sufficient cyber backstop to everything that we have in the kinetic arsenal, and even in terms of non-proliferation and counter-proliferation policy, stopping the Iranian nuke versus stopping Putin's nuclear saber rattling. There is a lot more overlap today. And our adversaries are quite good at expanding the Venn diagram, and we're still working in a world of kind of like what Ray said, of segregating out these issues. These are functional issues, these are regional issues, these are strategic issues, these are soft issues, these are hard issues. But it's much more of an aggregate, and it's getting more aggregated. So I think we have to roll with this opportunity. And unfortunately on Iran and Russia, kind of going to what Martha said, I do fear it is quite partisan. For lack of a better word, the zeitgeist, I think, in the States is that the Republicans are more hawkish on Iran, the Democrats are more hawkish on China. The only area of bipartisan consensus seems to be China. I would recommend what's going on in terms of the China Commission to be created on Russia, to be created on Iran, and see what kind of least common denominator issues you can scale up on from there. Number two, I know Ray kind of mentioned this Iran nuclear, what explains it, its domestic decisions. I'm working on a paper actually with a non-proliferation scholar. I think this combination of latency and hedging, latency being technical and hedging being political, best explains how Iran is able to exploit its status. It's a threshold status, but it's a threshold status that you can weaponize, such that when Iran launched those drones and missiles on April 13, April 14, there are two things it counted on, not its own defenses. Number one, politically it counted on the patron of Israel, America, restraining and constraining the freedom of action. And this was backstopped by the threats of incremental nuclear escalation. All the statements from 2022 and 2023, and certainly to 2024, about we have everything and it's like building a car and it only takes a week and all we need is this and that. The weaponization of both of these two, American fears and American constraint and restraint, coupled with the ability to threaten incremental nuclear escalation meaningfully, is going to create more deterrence problems with us vis-a-vis the Iranians. And then last thing, just about the divergent views, and Mark, I was thinking about Syria when you mentioned this, and again, think about compartmentalization. Never did the Russians provide air cover to the Iranians for any strike that the Israelis did in Syria. This is important to remember. And we have to walk and chew gum and deconflict at the same time on these issues. This was something Qasem Soleimani, Iran's chief terrorist, dreamed of. S-300s, S-400s aplenty in Syria. Not one of them turned on, or not one of them designed to provide coverage to where Iran, the IRGC, Lebanese Hezbollah, or any of the Shia militias were operating. And still, Iran covets this relationship with Russia. Why? Iran is trying to move from junior partner to something else. And that's why the relationship can be so one-sided. So that which may be not in the cost-benefit in the aggregate in terms of us may be seen in the eyes of the adversary, oh no, this is worth it for them. So things that may appear irrationally from one lens appear super rational for the other because they want to change some kind of a dynamic. I just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all of our panelists. Like I said, I'll stick around for a bit. I imagine others will stick around if you want to have a sidebar. And thanks for a really rich conversation. Obviously, everybody on the panel deserves an award. We just got through a policy panel in Washington, D.C., and nobody said artificial intelligence. So, hey, give a round of applause for that one. Also, nationalsecurity.gmu.edu. If you're not affiliated with NSI or not tracking, you can sign up for emails. Fault Lines podcast is fantastic. And Jessica Jones, Keelan is somewhere. Keelan. Kelly Carley's here. I saw Devin somewhere. Devin, Bernie. Chat with them too. Get connected. And thank you all for putting this together.